Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. But it almost wasn't. Roughly 3,000 years ago, a migration began in West Africa that would become the largest population movement in the continent's history. When geneticists finally mapped what happened, the results were staggering. In some regions, the original population was almost entirely replaced. The story begins in the borderlands between modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, a region of dense forest and river valleys where a group of farming communities developed something that would change the continent forever. They learned to farm. They learned to smelt iron. And then they moved. Iron tools meant cleared forests. Cleared forests meant farmland. Farmland meant surplus food. And surplus food meant population growth on a scale the hunter-gatherer communities around them could not match. The combination of iron axes and fire created a cycle. Cut the forest, burn the brush, plant the crops. When the soil was exhausted, move to the next patch and repeat. This slash-and-burn agriculture was devastatingly effective. It converted dense tropical forest into productive farmland at a pace no hunter-gatherer technology could match. Emerged approximately 1000 BCE in West Africa, vertical bar, lower third, vertical bar threes. Linguists had already traced the pattern. Over 500 languages spoken across sub-Saharan Africa belong to the Bantu language family. They all trace back to a single origin point in that same Nigeria-Cameroon borderland. But languages can spread through trade, cultural adoption, or prestige borrowing. The question was whether the Bantu expansion was a movement of language, a movement of people, or both. Linguists reconstructed the ancestral vocabulary. Proto-Bantu had words for farming, pottery, and ironworking. It did not have words for cattle. This told researchers what the original migrants carried with them. But vocabulary alone could not answer the demographic question. A language can spread without its speakers. English spread across India without replacing Indian ancestry. The test had to be genetic. In 2017, Pontus Skoglund and colleagues at Harvard published a landmark ancient DNA study in Science. They sequenced genomes from 16 individuals buried across Eastern and Southern Africa, spanning the past 8,000 years. The results were unambiguous. Before the Bantu expansion, the genetic landscape of Eastern and Southern Africa looked nothing like it does today. The ancient individuals from before the expansion carried DNA closely related to modern Khoisan populations, the San and Ko peoples of Southern Africa. These were the original inhabitants, hunter-gatherers whose ancestors had lived in these regions for tens of thousands of years. Then the farmers arrived, and within centuries, the genetic signature of the original populations nearly disappeared. The rock art tells the story of a world that vanished. Across Southern Africa, painted shelters document a hunter-gatherer way of life that stretched back at least 20,000 years. In 2020, Mark Lipson and colleagues expanded on Skoglund's work with a massive new dataset. Published in Nature, the study sequenced ancient genomes from across the continent, including individuals from the critical transition period when farmers first arrived. The data showed that in Eastern Africa, the genetic transition was swift, and nearly total populations that had been genetically distinct for thousands of years were replaced by Bantu, related ancestry within a span of just a few centuries. In Tanzania, ancient individuals from 4,000 years ago carried almost entirely Khoisan, related ancestry. Modern Tanzanians carry predominantly Bantu, related ancestry. The replacement was not gradual blending, it was demographic overwriting. In some areas, over 90% of the pre-existing genetic ancestry was replaced. This was not cultural exchange. This was one population expanding into territory occupied by another and becoming the overwhelming majority. The mechanism was not military conquest in the traditional sense. There is no archaeological evidence of large-scale warfare or coordinated violence associated with the Bantu expansion. It was something quieter and more permanent. A farming population simply outgrew everyone around them. Agricultural populations can grow at 10 to 20 times the rate of hunter-gatherer populations. A farming village of 200 can become 2,000 within a few generations. A hunter-gatherer band of 30 might remain 30 for centuries. The math alone was sufficient to drive replacement. No organized violence required. Just differential birth rates sustained across generations. The expansion followed river systems. The Congo Basin, the Great Lakes region, the Zambezi and Limpopo river corridors. Water was the highway. But here is the twist. The Bantu expansion was not one migration. It was at least two, possibly three, separated by centuries. The first wave moved south through the Congo Basin rainforest, staying close to the western coast. The second wave moved east, around the northern edge of the Congo forest, through the Great Lakes region, and then south along the East African highlands. But here is where the story takes a turn that complicates every simple narrative. The replacement was not total everywhere. In some regions, the original populations survived, and in others, something more complex happened. The farmers and the hunter-gatherers mixed. Modern Khoisan populations in Namibia and Botswana carry detectable Bantu-related ancestry, and modern Bantu-speaking populations in southern Africa carried detectable Khoisan ancestry. The replacement was not sterile. There was gene flow in both directions. In 2020, Ki Wang and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute published a study that added critical nuance. They found that the admixture patterns varied dramatically by region. In East Africa, the replacement was nearly complete. In Southern Africa, it was substantial but left significant Khoisan admixture. In parts of Central Africa, rainforest forager populations maintained their genetic distinctiveness far longer than expected. The Central African rainforest foragers, sometimes called pygmy populations, represent one of the oldest surviving lineages on Earth. Their DNA diverged from other African populations, roughly 200,000 years ago. Despite the Bantu expansion moving directly through their territories, these populations maintained substantial genetic distinctiveness. They adopted Bantu languages in many cases, but retained a significant portion of their ancient genetic heritage. The Khoisan peoples of southern Africa present perhaps the most striking case. They speak languages that contain click consonants found nowhere else on Earth. Their genetic lineage is among the deepest branches in the entire human family tree. And before the Bantu expansion, their genetic ancestors occupied a territory stretching from the southern tip of Africa all the way to East Africa, a continuous band of hunter-gatherer populations across the entire eastern and southern portion of the continent. Today, Khoisan-speaking populations survive in fragmented pockets in Namibia, Botswana, and Tanzania. The Hadza and Sandawe of Tanzania are genetic islands, surrounded by Bantu-speaking populations whose ancestors arrived thousands of years after theirs. The Hadza number roughly 1,300 people. They represent one of the last remaining populations practicing a fully hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Their DNA connects them to a lineage that once dominated an area the size of a continent. 1,300 people. That is what remains of a genetic landscape that once stretched across half of Africa. The archaeological record reinforces the DNA evidence. The Uru pottery tradition, one of the earliest Iron Age ceramic styles in East Africa, appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 2,500 years ago. Below the Uru layers, stone tools and microlithic technology from hunter-gatherer populations. Above them, iron tools, domesticated grain impressions in pottery, and settled village layouts. The transition in the archaeological record mirrors the genetic transition almost exactly. Radiocarbon dates from Uri pottery sites map almost perfectly onto the dates predicted by genetic models of the Bantu expansion. Two completely independent lines of evidence pointing to the same timeline. The speed of the transition raises its own questions. In some regions, the archaeological changeover from stone tools to iron tools happens within a single stratigraphic layer. Decades, not centuries. But the DNA also revealed something that no archaeology could. There was a second, much older replacement event in Africa that preceded the Bantu expansion by thousands of years. Scotland's data showed that in East Africa, a migration of pastoralist populations from the Horn of Africa preceded the Bantu arrival by roughly 1,000 years. These cattle-herding groups, related to modern Nilotic and Cushitic speakers, had already begun displacing the ancient hunter-gatherer populations. The Bantu expansion was not invading virgin territory. It was the second wave of demographic transformation in a region that had already experienced one. Eastern Africa was doubly overwritten. The pastoralists had already fragmented the continuous hunter-gatherer landscape of East Africa. When the Bantu farmers arrived 1,000 years later, they encountered a patchwork of pastoralist and hunter-gatherer territories. Each wave left its own genetic signature, layered on top of the last. The DNA of modern East Africans carries traces of all three populations, stacked like sediment in an archaeological trench. 3 layers of ancestry stacked on top of each other, each one erasing most of the one beneath it. 2 waves of replacement in 3,000 years. The hunter-gatherers never stood a chance. Yet the admixture data tells a more complicated story than simple replacement. Modern Bantu-speaking populations across southern Africa carry between 5 and 20% Khoisan-related ancestry. This means that while the demographic dominance shifted overwhelmingly toward the incoming farmers, intermarriage and gene flow were constant features of the process. People mixed, cultures blended, genetics merged. The click consonants found in some Bantu languages like Zulu and Xhosa are direct evidence of this mixing. Click sounds do not develop spontaneously. They were borrowed from Khoisan languages through sustained contact between communities. Languages borrow sounds from neighbors. DNA confirms the borrowing went both directions. The replacement was real, but it was not clean. It was messy, prolonged, and human. One striking example is the lactase persistence gene. Khoisan populations in some regions carry a variant for adult milk digestion that they could only have acquired through intermarriage with incoming pastoralist or Bantu populations. And Bantu-speaking populations in southern Africa carry immune system variants that originated in Khoisan populations. The gene flow was not one-directional. Each group gained something from the other. The Y chromosome evidence adds another dimension. Haplogroup E1b1a, the paternal lineage most strongly associated with Bantu-speaking populations, is now the single most common Y chromosome lineage in sub-Saharan Africa. It stretches from Cameroon to South Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean, one paternal lineage spanning an entire subcontinent. The scale of the demographic expansion is written directly in the Y chromosome of modern African populations. The parallel with Europe's population history is remarkable. Around 5,000 years ago, the Yamnaya steppe pastoralists expanded across Europe and replaced roughly 75% of the existing male lineages. The mechanism was similar, a technologically advantaged population expanding into territory occupied by smaller, less densely settled groups. 2 continents, 2 expansions, the same underlying mechanism. farming technology creating population growth differentials that overwhelmed the existing inhabitants through sheer numbers. The implications for modern Africa are profound. Over 300 million people today speak Bantu languages. They represent the genetic legacy of a farming revolution that began in a small corner of West Africa and reshaped an entire continent. The surviving Khoisan populations represent the last remnants of a genetic landscape that once covered half the continent. Their DNA carries information about the deepest branches of human evolution, lineages that diverged before any other modern human populations separated from each other. Their genetic lineage branches off before every other group of modern humans on the planet. When geneticists say the Khoisan carry the oldest lineages in the human family, they mean it literally. The genetic distance between a Khoisan individual and a West African Bantu speaker is greater than the distance between that same Bantu speaker and a European or East Asian person. The deepest genetic branch in all of humanity nearly vanished in a few thousand years. Efforts to preserve Khoisan genetic heritage are now underway. The Southern African Human Genome Program and the African Genome Variation Project have been collecting and sequencing DNA from remaining Khoisan communities. The urgency is real. Small populations are vulnerable to genetic drift, inbreeding, and cultural assimilation. The Khoisan languages are among the most endangered on Earth, and with them, the cultural knowledge that gives meaning to the genetic data. The Bantu expansion also challenges a common assumption about Africa. Many people outside the continent think of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of ancient, unchanging populations. The DNA evidence shows the opposite. Africa has experienced multiple massive population replacements, expansions, and contractions within the past 5,000 years alone. The continent's genetic history is as dynamic, violent, and complex as that of any other region on Earth. The idea that African populations were static before European contact is itself a myth rooted in colonial-era anthropology. The Bantu expansion alone displaced more people across a larger area than any European migration. Before the Industrial Age, the maps drew borders where none existed. The DNA drew migration, routes the map makers never imagined. African genomics is still in its early stages compared to European and Asian population genetics. The ancient DNA record is sparse because tropical heat degrades DNA far faster than cold northern climates. Most of what we know comes from a handful of studies and a few dozen ancient genomes. The full story of the Bantu expansion, including its timing, its regional variations, and the fate of every population it touched, cannot be told until hundreds more ancient African genomes are sequenced. Field laboratories are now being deployed directly to excavation sites, reducing the time between bone recovery and DNA extraction. The faster a sample reaches a clean room, the better the chances of recovering usable ancient DNA in tropical conditions. Every hour matters. In tropical heat, exposed ancient DNA degrades rapidly. The difference between a successful extraction and a failed one can come down to how quickly the sample reaches controlled conditions. Proposed sampling projects across West and Central Africa could fill the enormous gaps in the current dataset. If funded, the next decade of African ancient DNA research could produce as many genomes as Europe has sequenced in the past 20 years. The petrous bone, the dense bone surrounding the inner ear, has proven to be the best source for ancient DNA in tropical environments. Its density protects DNA from heat degradation far better than other skeletal elements. Every ancient African genome sequenced adds disproportionate value to our understanding. A single genome from a 3,000-year-old individual in Malawi can reshape models that took decades to build from modern DNA alone. The Bantu expansion is not just a genetic event. It is the foundation of modern sub-Saharan Africa. The languages, the farming traditions, the ironworking heritage, and the genetic ancestry of over 300 million people trace back to those original farming communities on the Nigeria-Cameroon border. And the populations they replaced are not gone. Their genetic legacy survives in every Bantu-speaking person who carries a fragment of Khoisan ancestry, in the click consonants embedded in Zulu and Xhosa, and in the 1,300 Hadza who still hunt on the same East African plains. Their ancestors walked for 100,000 years. A hunter returning at dusk. The same scene played out on these plains for 100,000 years before the first farmer arrived. 3,000 years ago, farmers left a forest, and nothing on the continent was ever the same. The question that remains is not whether the Bantu expansion happened. The DNA has settled that. The question is what happens to the populations that survived it. The Khoisan carry the oldest genetic lineages in humanity. Their languages encode sounds that exist nowhere else. Their cultural knowledge of desert survival, tracking, and plant medicine is irreplaceable. Pharmaceutical researchers have identified compounds in Khoisan traditional medicines with anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties unknown to Western science. When a language dies, the knowledge encoded in its vocabulary dies with it. If the Bantu expansion teaches us anything, it is that demographic change is the most powerful force in human history. Not war, not ideology, not disease. Simply more people moving into the spaces occupied by fewer people, generation after generation. The largest migration in African history left no monuments, no battlefield markers, no written accounts. It left only the DNA of the people it created and the fragmented survival of the people it nearly erased. And somewhere in the Kalahari tonight, a family sits around a fire, speaking a language older than agriculture, older than iron, older than iron, older than every migration that tried to silence it. The DNA is clear. The largest migration in African history replaced almost everything in its path, but not quite everything. And what survived may be the most important genetic heritage on Earth.